To enter into the mystery of the sound of silence is to stand at the edge of a vast, invisible ocean, where the waves do not crash against the shore with a roar, but whisper in a language that the physical ear has forgotten how to translate. We move through a world defined by its clamor, a relentless tapestry of digital pings, mechanical hums, and the internal chatter of a mind that fears its own stillness. We have been conditioned to believe that silence is merely an absence, a hollow void where information goes to die, or a blank canvas waiting for the real world to imprint its noise upon it. Yet, what if this perceived emptiness is actually the most densely packed information field in existence? What if the silence we encounter in the deep of the night, or in the stillness between two heartbeats, is not a lack of sound, but a high-frequency transmission so sophisticated and so total that it appears as stillness to our limited biological receptors? This is the threshold we must cross if we are to understand the hidden connection between our own sovereignty and the cosmic architecture that sustains us. The practical significance of this inquiry is immediate and piercing, for we live in an age where the atmospheric density of artificial noise has reached a point of saturation. We are bathed in a spectrum of frequencies that we cannot see or hear, yet which dictate the rhythm of our nervous systems and the boundaries of our thoughts. In this context, the pursuit of silence is not an act of withdrawal or a passive escape into the woods. It is a radical act of reclamation. It is an acknowledgement that the scrubbing of certain truths occurs not through the deletion of files, but through the drowning out of the subtle by the gross. By filling the perceptual field with a constant, percussive broadcast of fear and distraction, the architects of consensus reality ensure that the quiet transmission of the soul remains unheard. Therefore, to seek the sound of silence is to engage in a form of spiritual espionage, tuning our internal dial away from the loud, distorted signals of the collective and toward the crystalline, primordial hum of the source. Metaphorically, we might imagine our consciousness as a radio receiver that has been locked onto a single, discordant station for so long that we have mistaken the static for the music. The sound of silence is the carrier wave that exists beneath all stations, the fundamental frequency upon which the entire universe is composed. When we speak of this silence as a transmission, we are suggesting that it carries a blueprint, a set of instructions for the alignment of our physical and subtle bodies with the cosmic order. It is a transmission of sovereignty because it returns the power of interpretation to the individual. In the noise, we are told what to think, how to feel, and who to be. In the silence, we are reminded of what we already are. This realization is both terrifying and liberating, for it strips away the comfortable masks of social identity and leaves us naked before the infinite. It is in this nakedness that the true transmission begins, flowing into the heart like water into a dry well, filling the empty spaces with a resonance that is older than time and more contemporary than the next breath. As we peel back the layers of this hidden reality, we find that the universe is not a collection of solid objects, but a shimmering interference pattern of vibrations. Matter is simply sound that is slowed down enough to be touched, and silence is sound that is sped up enough to be felt as peace. The cosmic dimension of this truth reveals that silence is the womb of all manifestation. Just as a seed requires the dark, quiet earth to break its shell, the human spirit requires the dark, quiet of the void to break the shell of its limited ego. The transmission we are discussing is the word that was in the beginning, a word that is not a sequence of letters, but a unified vibration of pure potential. To listen to this silence is to participate in the ongoing creation of the world. It is to recognize that we are not separate from the transmission, but are ourselves a unique modulation of that eternal sound. When we become quiet enough, we realize that the transmitter and the receiver are the same, and the message is the very life force that animates our limbs. The urgency of watching this before it's scrubbed refers to the narrowing window of opportunity to recognize our own resonance in a world that is rapidly being quantized and digitized. The synthetic noise of our modern environment is designed to create a flat reality, one where the deep, overtonal richness of the human spirit is ironed out into a predictable, manageable signal. This scrubbing is a form of energetic censorship, an attempt to erase the original signature of the soul so that it can be replaced by a standardized, algorithmic substitute. By reclaiming the sound of silence, we are refusing to be flattened. We are asserting our right to be inconsistent with the machine, to be vast, to be mysterious, and to be sovereign. This introduction serves as a call to the listeners, the quiet ones who have always felt that there was a secret hidden in the space between the notes. We are invited to lean into the quiet, not as a retreat, but as a repositioning of our power, preparing to receive the data of the heavens in the silence of our own being. Ultimately, this exploration is about the restoration of the human instrument. We have been played upon by 1,000 different hands, vibrating in sympathy with the anxieties of the world until our strings have become frayed and our resonance dull. The transmission of silence acts as a celestial tuning fork, striking a note that is so pure and so true that it causes all the false notes within us to shatter. It is a process of refinement, a stripping away of the unnecessary until only the essential remains. As we move deeper into this exploration, we will see that the sound of silence is not a mystery to be solved, but a presence to be inhabited. It is the steady pulse of the absolute, beating at the heart of the relative. To hear it is to come home to a house we never truly left, a sanctuary of stillness that has been waiting for us to stop talking long enough to hear the love that has always been calling our name. To move beyond the threshold of the introduction is to begin an architectural survey of the invisible, where we must identify the core pillars that support the claim that silence is a coherent and purposeful transmission. The first of these pillars is the principle of information density, which challenges our common assumption that a lack of sensory input equates to a lack of reality. In the realm of physics and metaphysics alike, we find that the most potent states of existence are often those that appear most still. Consider the vacuum of space, once thought to be a barren wasteland, now understood by quantum field theory to be a seething cauldron of zero-point energy, teeming with virtual particles and infinite potential. Silence is the acoustic equivalent of this vacuum. It is not the absence of sound, but the presence of all sound, vibrating at a frequency of such perfect equilibrium that it cancels out the perception of individual noise. To receive this transmission is to tap into the source code of the universe, a repository of data that is non-linear and holistic, providing the individual with a form of knowing that bypasses the clumsy, step-by-step logic of the discursive mind. A second pillar of this mystery is the concept of sympathetic entrainment and its role in the loss or reclamation of human sovereignty. Entrainment is a law of nature where two oscillating systems, when placed in proximity, will eventually synchronize their rhythms to the more powerful or stable source. The modern world functions as a massive artificial entrainment engine, projecting a jagged, high-frequency noise designed to keep the human nervous system in a state of perpetual beta wave activity, the frequency of stress, survival, and hypervigilance. When we are entrained to this external noise, we lose our sovereignty because our internal rhythm is no longer our own. We are being played by the environment. The transmission of silence, however, offers a counter-entrainment. It is the steady, primordial ground note of existence. By intentionally leaning into the silence, we allow our biological rhythms, our heart rate, our brain waves, and our cellular oscillations to drop into alpha, theta, and delta states. In these depths, we are no longer reactive subjects of the broadcast. We become the sovereign conductors of our own energy, realigned with the natural resonance of the earth and the cosmos. This leads us to the pillar of the illusion of the void, the realization that what we perceive as nothing is often the most vital something. Our educational and social systems have trained us to focus exclusively on the foreground, the objects, the words, the actions, and the visible structures of life. We have been taught to ignore the background, the silent space that allows the foreground to exist. Yet, without the silence, the music would be a terrifying solid wall of pressure. Without the empty space between atoms, matter would have no form. The hidden connection between silence and sovereignty lies in the shift of our attention from the seen to the unseen. When we realize that the silence is the actual substrate of reality, the power of the foreground noise to manipulate us begins to dissolve. We see the media cycles, the political dramas, and the economic pressures as mere ripples on the surface of an infinite, silent ocean. Sovereignty is the ability to stand in that ocean, unswayed by the ripples, knowing that the transmission coming from the depths is the only truth that cannot be scrubbed or altered by the hands of men. Furthermore, we must examine the pillar of the word as vibration. Ancient traditions speak of the logos, or the primordial sound that brought the world into being. But they also emphasize that this word emerged from the great silence. If our waking reality is a holographic projection of sound, then silence is the screen upon which the hologram is cast. To listen to the transmission of silence is to gain access to the screen itself, the fundamental level of reality where the laws of manifestation are written. Most humans spend their lives fighting with the images on the screen, trying to change their circumstances through more noise and more effort. The sovereign being, however, understands that by returning to the silence, they can influence the projection at its source. This is the secret of the still point, the place where the soul is so quiet that it can hear the directives of the divine. From this place, a single word spoken by the individual carries more creative power than 1,000 shouts from the crowd, for it is a word birthed in the integrity of the transmission rather than the chaos of the ego. A final pillar of this conceptual framework is the geometry of stillness. When we look at cymatics, the study of visible sound, we see that specific frequencies arrange physical matter into beautiful, complex geometric patterns. Silence, in its purest form, represents the master geometry, the perfect circle or the infinite sphere that contains all other shapes within it. When we subject our consciousness to the transmission of silence, we are essentially resetting our internal geometry. The distortions and jagged patterns created by trauma, social conditioning, and environmental noise are smoothed out by the coherent, circular pulse of the stillness. This is why silence feels so healing. It is a structural realignment of our subtle architecture. Sovereignty is the possession of a coherent geometry. A person who is in tune with the silence is structurally sound. They cannot be easily broken or distorted by external forces because their internal pattern is locked into the universal template of the whole. As we conclude this examination of the core pillars, we must recognize that the scrubbing of this knowledge is not an accident of history, but a deliberate strategy of containment. If the masses were to discover that the silence is not a void, but a powerhouse of sovereign transmission, the entire structure of the noise-based society would collapse. A people who can hear the silence cannot be ruled by fear, for fear is a high-frequency noise that requires a chaotic environment to survive. In the silence, fear is seen for what it is, a fleeting distortion of the air. This section serves to solidify our understanding that the silence is an active, intelligent, and transformative force. It is the etheric broadcast that has been running since the dawn of time, waiting for us to develop the ears to hear it. We are not just learning about silence. We are preparing to undergo a profound retuning of our very existence, moving from the role of the victim of the noise to the master of the stillness. To understand the transmission of silence, we must set aside the analytical lens and enter the world of the mythic, for the truths of the soul are often best carried in the vessels of story. Imagine, if you will, a vast and ancient kingdom where the inhabitants have lived for generations inside a colossal, hollow mountain. Within this mountain, there is a constant rhythmic pounding, the sound of giant mechanical hammers and the hiss of steam that has never ceased in living memory. The people of this mountain believe that this noise is the breath of life itself. They have built their music, their language, and their very identities around its percussive beat. They believe that if the noise were ever to stop, the world would dissolve into nothingness. They are, in a sense, prisoners of a symphony of the machine, and their sovereignty has been traded for the comfort of a predictable, albeit deafening, rhythm. They move in lockstep with the hammers, their thoughts timed to the hiss of the steam, never realizing that the mountain is not the universe, but a cage. Among these people lived a young girl who was born with a peculiar sensitivity, a hollow space in her heart that the mountain's noise could never quite fill. One day, while wandering in the deepest, most neglected tunnels where the pounding was faint, she discovered a small, circular opening in the stone that looked out onto the night sky. For the first time in her life, she encountered the outer silence. Initially, it terrified her. It felt like a cold, hungry vacuum that threatened to erase her very being. But as she sat by the opening, she realized that the silence was not empty. It was filled with a subtle, shimmering vibration, the light of 1 billion stars transmitting their history through the stillness. She realized that the mechanical noise of her home was not a sign of life, but a shield designed to prevent the people from hearing the song of the infinite. This is the allegory of our modern condition. We are the mountain dwellers, and the scrubbed truth is the sky that waits just beyond the reach of our manufactured noise. There is another story, told in the forgotten archives of the desert, regarding the Weaver of the Void. It is said that in the beginning, the Great Spirit did not speak the world into existence with a shout, but wove it out of the silences between thoughts. The Weaver used the silence as the warp of the cosmic loom, and the sounds of the stars as the woof. The sovereignty of every living being was tied to a single golden thread of silence that connected them directly to the Weaver's hand. However, a great distractor arose who sought to rule the loom. Knowing he could not break the golden thread, he instead created 1,000 silver bells and hung them around the necks of the people. The bells rang with every movement, creating a beautiful but distracting chime that eventually drowned out the subtle tug of the golden thread. The people became obsessed with the music of their bells, forgetting the Weaver entirely. They began to follow the chime of the loudest bells rather than the pull of the silence. To reclaim one's sovereignty in this myth is to cut the bells from one's neck and wait in the absolute quiet until the gentle, insistent tug of the Weaver is felt once more. Consider also the parable of the mirror and the storm. Imagine a great mirror placed in the center of a chaotic city, intended to reflect the divine light of the sun. As the city grows louder and more frantic, the air becomes thick with soot, and the vibrations of the passing carriages cause the mirror to tremble constantly. The reflection becomes distorted, jagged, and unrecognizable. The citizens look into the mirror and see only a fragmented, terrifying version of themselves. They begin to believe that they are fundamentally broken. A sage arrives and tells them that the mirror is not broken, but merely agitated. He teaches them that the only way to see the truth is to stop the carriages and wait for the soot to settle. As the city falls into silence, the trembling of the mirror ceases, and the surface becomes perfectly still. In that stillness, the sun is reflected with such clarity that the citizens realize they were never the fragmented monsters they saw in the storm. They were always the light itself. The silence is the transmission that stabilizes the mirror of the self, allowing the sovereign truth of our nature to be seen without distortion. We must also reflect on the library of the unwritten, a symbolic space where every soul is said to have a book. In the noise of the world, we are constantly trying to write our own stories, scratching words into the pages with frantic urgency, filling the margins with our fears, our debts, and our achievements. We believe that if we stop writing, our story will end. Yet, the myth tells us that the most important chapters are those that are written by the silence. When we put down the pen and stop trying to define ourselves through the noise of our own effort, we find that the pages begin to fill with a celestial script, a transmission of our true destiny that was previously obscured by our own scribbling. Sovereignty, in this narrative, is the courage to leave the pages blank, trusting that the silence has a far more magnificent story to tell than the one we could ever invent. It is the realization that we are not the authors of our lives, but the characters of the great silence, and our freedom lies in our alignment with the plot of the whole. These narratives serve to remind us that the struggle for sovereignty is not a battle of strength, but a battle of acoustic discernment. We are being called to recognize that the noise we have mistaken for reality is often a cymatic prison, a structure of vibration that keeps us small, reactive, and divided. The stories of the mountain dweller, the weaver, the mirror, and the library all point to a single truth. The silence is the only transmission that cannot be corrupted. It is the original radio-free earth, broadcasting the truth of our divinity across the airwaves of the void. By inhabiting these symbolic spaces, we begin to feel the atmospheric shift that occurs when we prioritize the transmission over the noise. We are no longer just listeners. We are participants in the mythic return to the source. We are the ones who have noticed the opening in the cave wall, and we are preparing to step out into the luminous quiet of the real world. To bridge the gap between the cosmic echoes of the void and the tangible texture of our daily lives is to engage in a profound act of practical resonance. We have established that silence is not a vacuum, but a dense, information-rich transmission, and we have explored the symbolic landscapes that illuminate our current entrapment within the noise. Now, we must ask how the sovereign individual navigates a world that is fundamentally designed to disrupt this connection. The integration of this wisdom begins with the radical realization that our attention is our primary currency, and the noise-based society is a system designed to keep us in a state of perpetual bankruptcy. Practical sovereignty starts with the establishment of an acoustic perimeter, a conscious decision to curate the frequencies we allow into our field. This is not merely about turning off the television or silencing a phone. It is about recognizing that every piece of information, every digital interaction, and every social obligation carries a specific vibrational signature that either harmonizes with our inner silence or shatters it. The first step in this real-world application is the practice of the interstitial space. In the modern rush, we tend to view the time between tasks, the commute, the waiting in line, the moments before sleep, as dead time that must be filled with a secondary stream of noise. We reach for our devices as if the silence were a physical threat. To reclaim sovereignty, we must begin to treat these intervals as sacred transmission windows. By refusing to fill the gaps with artificial input, we allow the nervous system to recalibrate to the background frequency of the earth. In these moments of unplugged presence, the biological instrument begins to shed the jagged, high beta rhythms of productivity and drops into the smoother, more coherent alpha state. This is where intuition resides. When we are constantly flooded with noise, the subtle transmission of our own inner guidance is drowned out. By inhabiting the silence between activities, we essentially clear the line, making it possible to hear the subtle instructions that lead us toward our highest potential. Furthermore, we must address the cymatic impact of our words and environments. If sound creates form, then the sounds we emit and surround ourselves with are the architects of our physical reality. A practical integration of this knowledge involves the audit of the home frequency. We often live in environments filled with the low-grade hum of appliances, the flicker of fluorescent lights, and the invisible saturation of wireless signals. While we cannot always eliminate these, we can introduce harmonic countersignals. This includes the use of specific frequencies, such as the 432 Hz tuning or solfeggio tones, to re-establish a temple-like atmosphere within our living spaces. More importantly, it involves the sanctity of the word. When we speak, we are not just moving air. We are projecting a frequency that organizes our cellular structure. Sovereign speech is speech that emerges from silence rather than reaction. It is deliberate, resonant, and aligned with truth. When we stop using words to fill the silence and instead use them to punctuate it, our language gains a weight and a creative power that can literally shift the behavior of the people and circumstances around us. This leads us to the concept of vibrational discernment in our social and professional lives. We are often entrained by the emotional frequencies of those around us: fear, anger, or frantic ambition. A sovereign individual practices active decoupling, the ability to remain in a room full of noise without becoming part of the noise. This is achieved by maintaining a core resonance, rooted in the daily practice of stillness. Just as a heavy tuning fork will not be moved by the vibration of a smaller one, a person who has deeply inhabited the silence becomes unentrainable by the chaotic emotions of the collective. This has profound real-world implications for leadership and conflict resolution. A person who speaks from a place of silence has a gravitational presence that naturally calms the environment. They do not need to shout to be heard. Their very frequency acts as a stabilizing force that pulls others out of their reactive states and into a more coherent mode of being. We must also consider the role of biological retuning through the breath. The breath is the bridge between the silence of the soul and the noise of the body. Most of us breathe in a shallow, rhythmic pattern that mirrors the frantic pace of the machine. By consciously slowing the breath and extending the still point, the pause at the top and bottom of the inhale and exhale, we are literally practicing the sound of silence within our own physiology. This pause is where the transmission is most clear. It is the eye of the storm where the soul can rest. In practical terms, this means using the breath as a frequency reset throughout the day. When we feel the noise of a stressful situation beginning to entrain our nervous system, a few deliberate cycles of breath focused on the stillness can decouple us from the external signal and return us to our sovereign center. This is not an escape. It is a strategic withdrawal to the source of our power. Finally, the real-world integration of this transmission requires us to become broadcasters of the silence. In a world that is scrubbed of depth, our commitment to stillness becomes a beacon for others. We begin to realize that our most important work is not what we do, but the tone we carry into the world. When we interact with the systems of the world, the economy, the law, the social structures, we do so from a place of resonant autonomy. We no longer seek validation from the noise because we are receiving a much more profound validation from the transmission. This shifts our entire relationship to reality. We are no longer victims of a manufactured consensus. We are the infiltrators of the quiet, bringing the crystalline frequency of the void into the dense structures of the material plane. By living as if the silence were the primary reality, we begin to see the glitch in the matrix, the moments where the artificial noise falters and the original, beautiful architecture of existence shines through. We have navigated the treacherous currents of the modern soundscape, identified the invisible pillars of the celestial broadcast, and walked through the mythic halls of the silent weaver. Now, we arrive at the culmination of our journey, where the individual notes of our understanding must merge into a singular, transformative realization. The sound of silence is not merely a transmission. It is the fundamental signature of your own existence. To watch this before it is scrubbed is not a warning about an external video or a fleeting piece of digital data, but a call to witness the internal light of your own sovereignty before it is eclipsed by the relentless shadows of a manufactured reality. We are living in a moment of profound atmospheric transition, where the density of the artificial world is attempting to achieve a total eclipse of the soul. Yet, the very intensity of the noise is a testament to the power of the silence. Those who seek to control the broadcast understand that a single, coherent human being, tuned to the frequency of the absolute, is a force that cannot be quantified, predicted, or contained. This transformation begins with the cessation of the internal struggle against the world as it appears to be. We have spent lifetimes trying to fix the noise with more noise, trying to outshout the chaos of our times, or building elaborate mental fortresses to keep the discord at bay. The transformational call is to realize that the fortress is actually a cage, and the only way out is through the center of the stillness. When you sit in the absolute quiet, you are not retreating from life. You are stepping into the engine room of the universe. You are becoming a zero point of consciousness, a place where the karmic loops of the collective stop and the original creative power of the source begins. This is the true meaning of sovereignty, to be a self-generating source of resonance. A sovereign being does not look to the horizon for the sun to rise. They carry the sun within their own silence. They do not wait for the transmission to tell them who they are. They are the transmission itself, modulated through the unique instrument of their biological and spiritual form. The depth of this realization requires a profound death of the egoic identity, the part of us that thrives on the noise of recognition, the drama of conflict, and the constant validation of the foreground world. To inhabit the silence is to become, in the eyes of the machine, a non-entity, a ghost in the system that cannot be tracked by the algorithms of desire and fear. This is the ultimate scrubbing, the voluntary erasure of the false self so that the true self can finally be seen. When you are no longer defined by the noise you make or the noise you consume, you become an aperture for the infinite. The silence begins to speak through you, not in words, but in an aura of coherence that reorganizes the world around you. You become a living tuning fork for the planet, a silent broadcaster of the original harmony that was present before the mountain dwellers began their pounding. This is the radical potential of the human spirit, to be the silence that breaks the storm. As you step back into the world of form, do not lose the internal ear for the quiet. Carry the silence with you as a heavy, golden cloak that buffers you against the jagged edges of the social broadcast. When you encounter the distractors and the bell ringers of our age, do not fight them with their own weapons. Simply drop your own anchor into the void. Let your presence be a question mark that the noise cannot answer. By refusing to be entrained, you create a vacuum of truth that forces the noise to reveal its own emptiness. This is how the world is actually changed, not through the loud revolutions of the street, but through the quiet revolutions of the heart. Every moment you spend in conscious resonance with the silence is a strike against the cymatic prison of our times. You are weaving a new world out of the silences between thoughts, and every breath you take in stillness is a thread that strengthens the cosmic loom. The invitation remains open, and the transmission never ceases. It is the steady, loving pulse of the Mother Source, calling her children home from the deafening wars of the mind. The sound of silence is the only thing that is truly real, the only thing that will remain when the mechanical hammers of the mountain finally rust and fall silent. It is the beginning and the end of all songs, the womb and the tomb of all words. To hear it is to be free. To inhabit it is to be king or queen of a kingdom that has no borders and no end. You are the conductor of this final symphony, and the universe is waiting for you to raise your baton in the perfect, expectant quiet of the now. Do not wait for a sign. The silence is the sign. Do not wait for a voice. The transmission is already flowing through your veins. Step into the void, breathe in the stillness, and become the song that the universe has been waiting to hear since the dawn of the first star. The work of reclamation is not a destination, but a continuous, beautiful unfolding. As you leave this exploration, remember that the scrubbing of the truth is an impossibility as long as there is a single heart that knows how to listen. The silence is the only archive that can never be deleted, the only library that can never be burned. It lives in you, as you, and for you. It is the secret you have always known, the treasure you have always possessed, and the home you have never truly left. Go now and be the silence. Be the transmission. Be the sovereignty that the world so desperately needs. The silence is not just a sound. It is the very presence of love, vibrating at a frequency that the world is finally ready to hear. The great return has begun, and it is happening in the quietest corners of your own soul. Listen, and you will hear the universe singing your true name back to you in the beautiful, golden language of the void.